Coravanta coverage of big news about Blake Lively. Hi besties, welcome back to the channel, because once again we are deep in the weeds of a story that just keeps getting uglier the more documents, messages, and depositions come out, and today we are talking about how Blake Lively truly believed she had everyone on her side, how she thought the entire industry, the cast, the author, and even the narrative itself would bend to her will, and how that confidence slowly unraveled once the truth started leaking out in sworn testimony, because for months Blake and her attorney stood in court and in public insisting she had absolutely nothing to do with the issues on set, nothing to do with people unfollowing Justin Baldoni, nothing to do with the fractures in the cast, and nothing to do with the hostile environment that emerged in post-production. But the paper trail tells a very different story, a story of calculated influence, quiet manipulation, and deliberate triangulation that started the moment she realized she did not control the film she was starring in, because what Blake never expected was that the film was already complete in spirit, structure, and authorship before she ever tried to reshape it. The movie had been shot entirely under Justin's vision, and Blake walked into post-production realizing she was not the author of the story, not the architect of the edit, and not the person holding the creative steering wheel, and that realization changed everything, because instead of accepting that reality, she went full throttle into post-production politics, quietly working behind the scenes to turn people against Justin, isolate him, and build support for her own cut of the film. And the first domino she needed to tip was the most important one of all, the author of the book itself, Colleen Hoover. Blake understood something very clearly, that without Colleen Hoover on her side, she could not credibly argue that her version of the film was the more authentic adaptation, because Blake herself had never read the book, something she later admitted under oath. She only knew the script, she did not understand the deeper themes, the fan expectations, or the emotional architecture of the story, so she needed someone who did, and Colleen was that person, and so Blake made her an offer that felt flattering, validating, and irresistible: access to the editing bay, access to Sony executives, access to the decision-making process, and permission to pore over the footage and submit pages and pages of notes. Not because Blake wanted collaboration, but because Blake needed cover. She needed Colleen's credibility to mask her own lack of authorship, and for a while, it worked. Colleen was brought into the edit, she reviewed cuts, she offered feedback, and she believed she was being valued as a creative partner. But what Colleen did not realize at the time was that by stepping into that role, she was also stepping into Blake's strategy, and eventually, under oath, Colleen would reveal exactly how deep that strategy went. One of the most telling moments comes from a deposition question that seems small on the surface but explodes under scrutiny, when an attorney asks Colleen about unfollowing Justin Baldoni before the film's premiere, and Colleen confirms that she did, and when asked why, her answer is simple, direct, and devastating. She says she did it because Blake asked her to, not because of her own conflict, not because of personal offense, not because of independent judgment, but because Blake requested it. And that single admission cracks open the entire narrative Blake and her legal team tried to build, because they repeatedly claimed that people unfollowed Justin on their own due to their own experiences, and yet here is the author admitting that the action was prompted directly by Blake. And it doesn't stop there, because when asked about a phone call in May where Blake allegedly told Colleen that she hated Justin, Colleen suddenly can't remember. She says the language doesn't sound like something she would normally say. And that selective memory is important, because just days later, Blake sent a text to Taylor Swift that contradicts Colleen's uncertainty entirely, a text where Blake confidently claims that Colleen reached out to her on her own, horrified, saying Justin was running an internal smear campaign, that he lied, that Colleen hated him, that she had been his safety net and was discarded. And that narrative was not only false, it was flipped completely upside down by Colleen's sworn testimony. And then there are the receipts beyond Colleen, because there is documented evidence of Blake coordinating unfollows across the cast. Jenny Slate texting Blake to confirm she unfollowed Justin for her, that her sister unfollowed him, that her assistant unfollowed him, and this wasn't organic, this wasn't spontaneous, this was organized, intentional, and strategic. And Blake knew exactly what she was doing, because social signaling matters in Hollywood. Unfollows create narratives, they suggest wrongdoing without proof, they plant suspicion, and Blake leaned into that tactic hard, all while insisting publicly that she had nothing to do with it. Meanwhile, Blake was also spreading a very specific lie on set, a rumor that Justin had allegedly claimed Colleen shared his religious faith, something that never originated with him, never appeared in an interview, never came from Colleen herself, but began online as fan speculation on BookTalk and TikTok, because fans couldn't understand why Colleen would sell the IP to Justin, and instead of shutting that rumor down, Blake weaponized it. She used it to frame Justin as deceptive, manipulative, even cult-like, despite the fact that Wayfarer, the company involved, is not an officially affiliated religious organization, does not require religious alignment, and works with people of all backgrounds. And yet Blake went further, calling Justin a cult leader, saying he thought he was a prophet, planting language that was inflammatory, stigmatizing, and completely unsupported by evidence. And while Blake portrayed Colleen as excluded or sidelined by Justin, the text record shows the opposite. Justin communicated directly with Colleen, sought her feedback, involved her in script revisions, and treated her as an executive producer. So when Justin and Jamie later confided in Colleen about the very real power struggle happening in post-production, a struggle acknowledged by Sony, Wayfarer, and everyone involved, Colleen didn't want to believe it, because Blake had already positioned herself as the ally, the collaborator, the one granting access, and Colleen, feeling flattered and protective of her newfound role, took offense and ran back to Blake, and Blake responded not with transparency, but with escalation, giving Colleen her own editing room and having her draft pages of notes to send to Sony executives, notes Blake herself could not author because she didn't know the story well enough to do so. But Colleen alone wasn't enough. Blake needed the cast, and that presented a problem. Because Blake didn't actually have relationships with most of them, she wasn't on set. During Isabella Ferrer's scenes as young Lily, she barely worked with Alex. She had limited overlap with Brandon Sklena, and Isabella's experience was almost entirely with Justin and Wayfarer, and by all accounts, it was fine until Blake entered the picture, and this is where things cross into truly inappropriate territory, because executives discussing production conflicts with the author is one thing, but bringing young cast members into internal disputes is irresponsible, and yet that's exactly what happened. Colleen and Blake pulled cast members into the politics, framed narratives, and turned professional disagreements into personal allegiances. At Book Bonanza in Texas, an event Justin was originally meant to attend, Colleen invited Isabella, Brandon, and Blake, and Justin was suddenly removed from the lineup. And Isabella testified that Colleen told her Justin was no longer welcome due to recent events, including alleged on-set behavior and a dinner that made Colleen uncomfortable, specifically tied again to the false claim about religion, and somehow Isabella came to believe she was replacing Justin at the event, even texting that Colleen had disinvited him, and while she later hedged on whether that was an assumption, she confirmed that Colleen absolutely had a say, and what was screened at Book Bonanza was not Justin's cut, it was Blake's cut, with Colleen's support, and this was strategic, because Blake discovered Justin was planning to attend Book Bonanza and screen the film for fans, and she refused to promote the film if he was allowed that platform, so she leveraged Colleen, took over the event, and positioned her cut as the definitive version, and every relationship Blake formed during this time was transactional, not genuine. She didn't care about Colleen, Isabella, Brandon, or Jenny. She cared about building an army, collecting flying monkeys, identifying each person's emotional trigger, and feeding them just enough misinformation to keep them loyal and hostile toward Justin, and the promise that sealed Colleen's loyalty wasn't friendship, it was the sequel, the idea that Blake and Colleen could do it themselves, regain control of the IP, and elevate Colleen into the same celebrity stratosphere, and the group chats from June 19th show exactly how quickly this turned into mean girl behavior, mocking Justin, calling him a sociopath and a narcissist, laughing about it, and emboldening each other, and Blake accusing Justin of exactly the traits she herself was displaying. Because once the film premieres, the power shifts, the leverage disappears, and what happens next exposes just how desperate Blake and Ryan become once they realize they no longer control the narrative. And this is where everything starts to fall apart, because once the film finally leaves Blake and Ryan's hands and enters the real world, the illusion of control disappears almost overnight, and you can actually feel the panic setting in through the text messages, through the frantic praise, through the love bombing, and through the sudden obsession with blaming anyone except themselves for the backlash that starts bubbling online, because up until the premiere, Blake and Ryan had leverage. Real leverage. The release itself was the hostage. Sony needed them to cooperate, Wayfarer needed them to show up, the press tour needed them to smile and play nice, But once the film was officially out, once the audience had access, once social media had something concrete to react to, Blake and Ryan lost the one thing that had kept everyone walking on eggshells. And suddenly they were just two powerful people with no actual authority over the IP, the studio, or the public conversation, and that's when the scrambling begins. On August 10th, right as the online conversation starts heating up, Ryan sends Colleen one of the most unhinged, self-indulgent, and revealing text messages I have ever seen from someone who technically had nothing to do with the making of the film, a message that reads less like congratulations and more like a manifesto, where he positions himself as if he were the studio, the savior, the architect of the success, and the moral authority in the room. Congratulating Colleen and Blake not just for the film's performance, but for what he frames as a righteous victory over Justin, mocking him, degrading him, and implying that the film's success is proof that Justin deserved to be humiliated and discarded. And what's so striking is how Ryan repeatedly centers himself in a story that isn't his, talking about how proud he is of you and me, how we breathe rare air, how we've pulled this off, how we showed the industry a lesson, when in reality, he did not direct the film, he did not write it, he did not finance it, and he did not own it, yet he speaks as if he were the head of Sony, as if he personally greenlit the project, as if the audience showed up for him, and while he's doing that, he's also love-bombing Colleen aggressively, telling her she's an apex storyteller, dangling proximity, access, validation, and belonging, inviting her to cottages, promising celebration, reinforcing the idea that she now belongs in their world, their class, their circle, and at the same time, he's feeding her lies about Justin, claiming that Justin hired a crisis team, that he's manipulating social media, that bots are being deployed, that the backlash isn't real, that it's artificial, coordinated, and malicious, and this is important because it's textbook gaslighting, instead of allowing Colleen to process the very real discomfort her own readers are expressing, instead of letting her consider that fans might genuinely feel alienated, disappointed, or misled by the adaptation. Ryan reframes the entire thing as an attack, a smear, a dirty trick by Justin, and Colleen, who openly admits she has no PR team, no experience with this level of scrutiny, and no framework for understanding online discourse, accepts that explanation, because it's comforting, because it absolves her of responsibility, and because it keeps her aligned with power. Colleen's response to Ryan's message shows just how deeply that influence had taken hold. Because she thanks him not just for support, but for making her feel welcome and valued, something she repeatedly credits Blake for, and she frames herself as lucky, as grateful, as someone who doesn't quite belong but is being generously pulled into the fold, and that dynamic matters, because it explains why she was willing to overlook contradictions, ignore evidence, and repeat narratives that weren't grounded in fact. She was being made to feel special, chosen, elevated, and that's intoxicating, especially for someone who came from a largely independent, self-directed career and suddenly found herself being told she was now operating at the same level as Hollywood royalty. What Ryan and Blake never seem to understand, though, is how social media actually works, because they treat it like legacy media, like something you can pressure, influence, or spin through back channels, publicists, and intimidation. And that's not how it functions anymore. You don't win social media by declaring victory, you don't silence criticism by calling it fake, and you don't convince audiences by telling them their reactions aren't real, and that's why their obsession with bots is so revealing, because it's the only explanation they can tolerate. The idea that real people, especially women, especially readers, especially Colleen's own fan base, might be unhappy with how this was handled, is unacceptable to them. So they invent a villain, they point to a crisis team, they suggest manipulation, and they double down on smearing Justin to keep Colleen emotionally triangulated away from him. And here's the thing, digital movements don't happen overnight, they don't materialize in a single day or even a week. Organic backlash builds over time, through shared reactions, discussions, and personal disappointment, and what was happening online was not some sudden, coordinated assault, it was readers talking to each other, fans comparing notes, women expressing discomfort, and Blake and Ryan had no way to stop that, because they don't control the audience, and once Sony distances itself, once the studio fulfills its obligations and steps back, Blake and Ryan are left exposed, still pretending they're in charge, still acting like they have leverage they no longer possess, still speaking as if they're the gatekeepers of a world that has already moved on. What becomes painfully clear through these messages is that Ryan, in particular, is performing authority he does not actually have. He talks like a studio head, praises himself like an executive, claims victories that aren't his, and frames the film's success as a personal triumph over Justin, when in reality, the success came from an existing fan base, a popular IP, and years of reader investment, not from his involvement, and yet he uses that perceived success to justify cruelty, to demean Justin, to mock him, to frame him as a predator, a fraud, a narcissist, while simultaneously positioning himself and Blake as moral champions, and that hypocrisy is staggering, because everything they accuse Justin of, manipulation, deception, exploitation, is exactly what they're doing to Colleen in real time. Colleen, meanwhile, begins to crack under the pressure, admitting in later messages that the experience has been overwhelming, that she feels physically unwell, that she's unsure how to respond, that she's relying on intuition instead of strategy, and yet even in that vulnerability, she never questions the core narrative she's been fed. She assumes Justin's team is behind the backlash, she assumes the criticism isn't genuine, and she aligns herself fully with Blake and Ryan, defending them publicly, spreading their version of events to outlets like the Daily Mail, and becoming an active participant in the smear, not because she's evil, but because she's been pulled into a worldview where dissent equals attack and accountability equals betrayal. And the irony is brutal, because despite all the talk about predators, frauds, and imposters, the people who actually disappear after this are not Justin, but Blake and Ryan. Projects dry up, collaborations vanish, enthusiasm cools, and suddenly the woman everyone claims wants to work with Blake isn't working with Blake at all, while Colleen, somehow, walks away largely unscathed, still publishing, still adapting, still moving forward, even though she played a central role in excluding, discrediting, and isolating the director of her own film, and that disconnect should make everyone uncomfortable, because it shows how power shields some people while exposing others. At the end of the day, the way Blake and Ryan secured control of the cut wasn't through artistry, collaboration, or leadership, it was through division, by turning Colleen against Justin, then using Colleen to turn Isabella against Justin, then orchestrating unfollows, exclusions, and public silence, creating the illusion of consensus where none actually existed. And this transcript, these messages, these depositions, are just a fraction of what's coming, because there are hundreds of documents still being unsealed, timelines still being reconstructed, and narratives still collapsing under their own weight. So when you zoom out and look at the full picture, what you're really seeing isn't a feminist victory or a creative triumph. It's a case study in how power operates when it's threatened, how easily people can be manipulated with access and validation, and how quickly the truth starts leaking once the leverage is gone. And as more comes out, it becomes harder and harder to maintain the fiction that Blake and Ryan were innocent bystanders in all of this, because the receipts tell a different story. One of control, coercion, and calculated influence, and we're only getting started. This is just one slice of a much larger puzzle, and as more documents are released, as more people go on record, and as the timelines become clearer, this story is going to look very different from the one Blake tried to sell. So let me know what you think in the comments. Give the video a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't, hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next, because there is a lot more to unpack, and I'll be right here breaking it all down.